front is not moving eastwards, it is slowly moving westwards. So we have to make sure that Ukraine gets into a position of strength, and then it should be the Ukrainian government to decide on the next steps in terms of opening peace talks and how to
pressures on supply and demand have driven gas prices up by roughly 50% so far this year. European countries heavily reliant on Russian gas are navigating a complex energy landscape as U.S. sanctions on Gazprom Bank take effect on December 20, 2024. These sanctions have created significant challenges for nations like Slovakia, Hungary, and Austria, which rely on long-term contracts with Gazprom.
Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're taking a look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Yeah.
And, well, I gotta say, there's so much information out there. It's kind of overwhelming.
It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, every day it feels like there's a new headline.
Exactly. We've got news articles, expert analysis, military reports.
Right.
We even managed to get a first-hand account from a former NATO soldier for this one.
Oh.
So many different viewpoints. It's tough to sort through it all.
Yeah, and that's what we're here for, right?
Absolutely. We're going to try to make sense of this whole thing and, try to figure out what's really going on and what it all means for everyone involved.
Right. Cut through all that noise.
Yeah. So let's start with the most obvious question. Is there any chance of peace talks anytime soon?
Well, if we go by what the Kremlin is saying, it doesn't seem likely. I mean, Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, flat out said there's no basis for negotiations right now.
Oh, wow.
But what's interesting is, with Trump back in the White House, there's all this talk about how things might change.
You think Trump coming back could really shift things? I mean, his stance on Ukraine in his last term was, well, kind of all over the place, wasn't it?
It definitely raised some eyebrows, yeah. You look at his past actions and statements, and there are a few different ways things could go. For example, remember how he used to praise Putin and even question the U.S.'s commitment to NATO?
Oh, yeah. And he was always going on about corruption in Ukraine.
Exactly. He even hinted that they were partly to blame for the whole conflict.
Wow.
So there's a chance, and it's a real chance, that he might cut back on U.S. support for Ukraine and push for a deal that's more favorable to Russia.
That would be a huge change from how things are going now.
100%. And even if Trump doesn't go that far, just his words alone, his rhetoric, could embolden Putin and make it harder to support Ukraine internationally.
That's a really good point.
It's a tricky situation, that's for sure.
So even if Trump doesn't completely change the game, it sounds like those big issues driving the conflict are still there, right?
Right. I mean, the core issues are still there.
Yeah.
The territorial disputes between Russia and Ukraine, and Ukraine wanting to join NATO.
Right. That's not going away overnight, is it?
No, not at all. It's been brewing for years.
Years.
And neither side seems willing to budge on their core demands. Like, Russia isn't giving up the areas they've taken, not without a fight.
Of course.
And Ukraine is adamant about its right to decide its own future, which includes that security guarantee from NATO. They still see joining NATO as the best way to get that.
Right. And that whole NATO membership thing is a sticky issue all on its own, isn't it? It seems like they're kind of taking a wait-and-see approach, especially with Trump back in the picture.
Yeah, it's definitely a balancing act for NATO. They want to help Ukraine, but don't want to set off Russia either.
Yeah, it's a tightrope walk for sure.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, Zelensky is asking for more reinforcements on the Eastern Front, in those regions where Russia's been gaining ground, Donetsk, Zaporizhia.
Yeah, and the U.S. just greenlit another $725 million in military aid.
$725 million. That's a lot of firepower.
It is, and it includes all sorts of equipment and support. Although they haven't really said what specific weapons are in there.
Ah, the good old strategic ambiguity, huh?
It's pretty standard when it comes to military aid. They don't want to tip their hand and risk making things worse,
I guess that makes sense. But it's kind of like a proxy war then, isn't it? The West supplying Ukraine with weapons while trying to avoid a direct fight with Russia.
Yeah.
But then you've got Russia's deputy foreign minister, Rabkov, talking about stronger military means.
Right.
What does that even mean? How do you define the limits of a conflict like this when things are so unpredictable?
That's the million-dollar question. I mean, Rabkov's statement, it suggests that Russia is ready to escalate if they feel threatened. It's like a game of chicken.
The game of chicken. I like that.
Yeah, two people driving towards each other, and the first one to swerve loses. In this case, the stakes are much higher, though.
Yeah, no kidding. And it's not just about boots on the ground either, right? We're seeing a lot of drone warfare now, too.
Absolutely. Both sides are using them.
Yeah. Russia hitting Ukraine's infrastructure and Ukraine trying to defend against it.
Yeah, it's really changed the face of warfare, hasn't it?
And speaking of technology and warfare, I was reading about this interesting thing with the British Challenger 2 tank. It's supposed to be this super tough machine.
Oh, yeah, a real beast.
But apparently it's having some trouble in Ukraine, and not because of enemy fire.
Oh, what's the problem then?
Mud.
Mud.
Yeah. Ukraine's famous black soil is super fertile, but when it rains, it turns into this thick, sticky mess.
Ah, I see.
And there are reports of these Challenger tanks getting bogged down, stuck in the mud.
Wow. So even with all the high-tech weaponry, sometimes it's the simple things that can really trip you up.
It's a good reminder that war is never as simple as it seems on paper, isn't it? It's about people, about the environment, about so many factors we can't always predict.
Absolutely. And that brings us to that former NATO soldier's perspective. They're really worried about what they see as a march to war. They're worried about escalation.
Yeah, and the thing that really stood out to me was what they said about the burden of war always falling on the working class.
It's powerful stuff. I mean, that quote, I think it really sums it up. Joe Biden, Keir Starmer, David Lammy, Macron, the Western leaders as an entity, none of you would fight on the front line, and you certainly wouldn't expect your kids to, so don't expect us to either.
Wow.
It's a really powerful statement.
It really makes you think about who benefits from all this and who pays the price.
Exactly. And that soldier's perspective, it brings up some important questions. Like, what would a working class foreign policy look like? What if diplomacy and conflict prevention were always the top priorities?
Those are questions we should all be asking, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's food for thought.
So we've got stalled peace talks, a constantly changing battlefield, and a former soldier warning us about the real human cost of this conflict. It's a lot to process.
It really is.
Yeah.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's still so much more to unpack here, like NATO's role, the potential for things to spiral out of control, and the energy crisis that's unfolding alongside all of this.
Absolutely. There's a lot more to discuss, but we'll take a break here for now. Join us for part 2, where we'll dig deeper into these issues and try to make sense of this tangled web of global challenges.
Sounds good.
That former NATO soldier's take on a working-class foreign policy really got me thinking.
Yeah, it's definitely a different way of looking at things.
It really challenges the way we normally think about these global issues.
It does, doesn't it?
Yes.
It's like they're saying, hey, we're the ones putting our lives on the line.
Exactly.
Couldn't we have a say in how things are run? It's a call for accountability and, maybe a shift in priorities.
I can see that. Instead of focusing on all those abstract geopolitical goals, maybe a working-class foreign policy would try to avoid conflict in the first place.
Right, exactly.
And, make sure regular people aren't the ones who suffer the most from these international crises.
Yeah. Imagine if diplomacy and preventing conflict were always the top priorities, instead of resorting to military action.
Yeah.
And what if we put working families first when we're making foreign policy decisions, instead of, say, the interests of weapons manufacturers?
That's a really different way of thinking about it.
It is.
But bringing it back to Ukraine, what do you think are the most likely scenarios we might see play out in the near future?
Well, as we talked about earlier, a negotiated settlement doesn't seem very likely right now.
Right.
Both Russia and Ukraine are pretty dug in on their positions.
Yeah.
And those fundamental disagreements over territory and NATO membership, those aren't going away easily.
So if talks are off the table for now, does that mean we're looking at a long, drawn-out war? Like a stalemate that could go on for years?
It's definitely a possibility, and a worrying one for sure.
Yeah.
The longer this drags on, the greater the risk of things spiraling out of control. You could have miscalculations, accidents, even unforeseen events that could escalate the conflict.
That's a pretty scary thought. With so much military power concentrated in one place, it feels like one wrong move could have catastrophic consequences.
You're right. That's why it's so important to keep communication channels open, even if formal peace talks aren't happening.
Right.
Even small steps like building trust and communicating clearly can help reduce the risk of misunderstandings that could lead to unintended escalation.
It's a real balancing act, isn't it?
It is.
Trying to support Ukraine without provoking Russia and starting a wider war.
Yeah, the U.S. and its allies are walking a tightrope here. They're trying to give Ukraine what it needs to defend itself, but they also have to be careful not to escalate things.
And that reminds me of what that former soldier said about a march to war. It's a chilling thought that we're not just talking about abstract ideas here. We're talking about the very real potential for suffering and loss of life.
Absolutely. Their words are a stark reminder of the human cost of these conflicts. It's easy to get caught up in the political and strategic aspects, but it's real people who suffer the most.
So if peace talks are on hold and the threat of escalation is hanging over everything, what are some possible ways this could all unfold?
Well, one possibility is a major shift in the military balance on the ground. Imagine if Ukraine, with the help of the West, manages to inflict heavy losses on Russian forces or take back some key territory.
That would definitely shake things up, wouldn't it?
It would. A big Ukrainian victory could force Russia to rethink their objectives and maybe make them more willing to negotiate. But on the other hand, if Russia manages to achieve their military goals and hold on to those areas, it could lead to a long, drawn-out conflict or a settlement that favors Russia.
So basically, the future of this conflict depends on what happens in those key battle zones.
Yeah, to a large extent, yes. But we can't ignore the role of external actors either.
Right. Like China. They've been playing it pretty cautiously, offering Russia diplomatic support, but also expressing some concerns about the economic and geopolitical fallout of a prolonged war.
China's a major player on the world stage, and their actions could have a big impact on how this unfolds. And then there's the wild card of Trump's return.
Ah, yes. Good old unpredictable Trump.
His foreign policy can be unpredictable, and his past dealings with Putin add another layer of uncertainty.
It's like we're trying to predict the weather months in advance.
It is. There are so many factors that could influence how this conflict plays out.
A real tangled web.
Yeah. But one thing's for sure, the stakes are incredibly high.
No doubt about it. And not just for Ukraine and Russia, but for the entire world.
Right. It's a global issue now.
And amidst all the uncertainty and geopolitical maneuvering, it's easy to forget about the human cost, those whose lives are being torn apart by this conflict.
You're absolutely right. We can't forget about the civilian casualties, the millions displaced from their homes, the trauma and suffering.
Heartbreak.
Those are the true costs of war.
And it's not just the immediate impact either. This war is having a ripple effect across the globe.
Oh.
Driving up energy prices, disrupting supply chains, and creating a sense of instability.
Exactly. Everything's interconnected. Conflicts like this one have consequences that reach every corner of the planet. Economies, societies, individual lives, they're all affected.
It's a sobering thought, and it really highlights the importance of peace, diplomacy, and de-escalation.
I agree. War should always be the last resort.
Well said. This conversation has been incredibly insightful.
It has been.
But I think it's time to shift gears a bit and focus on the energy crisis.
Good idea. It's a major part of this whole situation.
Absolutely. It's deeply intertwined with the conflict in Ukraine, and it has its own set of consequences.
It does, and those consequences are global.
Exactly. So join us for part 3, where we'll explore the energy crisis in more detail and discuss what it means for all of us. Okay, let's talk energy. We keep hearing about how Europe is in a tough spot, especially with winter coming.
Right.
But it feels like this is way bigger than just one region, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. This energy crunch is impacting the whole global economy.
Wow. How so?
Well, think about it. The conflict in Ukraine has disrupted the flow of oil and gas,
Right?
which were already in high demand as it was. Now you have everyone scrambling for other sources of energy,
Yeah.
and that drives up prices everywhere.
So it's like a global bidding war for energy.
In a way, yeah. You see Europe turning to liquefied natural gas, LNG, from places like the United States and Qatar.
Okay.
But that increased demand for LNG, it puts pressure on supply chains and makes it more expensive for everyone, not just Europe.
So even countries that aren't directly involved are feeling the squeeze.
Exactly. And this situation has really exposed just how reliant we are on fossil fuels, hasn't it?
It's kind of a wake-up call, isn't it?
It is. It's a push to move towards those renewable sources,
Yeah.
like solar, wind, geothermal.
So could this crisis actually be a turning point?
Possibly, yeah. It could push us towards a more sustainable energy future. But it's not a guarantee. Switching to renewables takes a lot. Investment, technology, political willpower. And let's be honest, there's always that temptation to stick with what we know, those fossil fuels, even though we know they're not sustainable in the long run.
It's that short-term comfort versus long-term thinking thing again, isn't it?
Exactly. And that's where real leadership comes in. We need to take this opportunity to break free from that dependence on fossil fuels and invest in a cleaner energy future.
You know, it's interesting that some of the sources brought up the Cold War, how the U.S. was worried about Europe relying too much on Soviet energy back then.
Yeah.
What can we learn from that?
It's a good comparison. The fear then was that relying on Soviet gas would give Moscow too much power, too much leverage.
Right.
And today, we're seeing something similar with Russia, using its energy exports as a way to pressure its opponents.
So it shows that energy security isn't just about keeping the lights on. It's
Exactly.
tied up with politics and national security, too.
Absolutely. It shows the risk of relying too heavily on one supplier, no matter who they are. That's why it's so important to diversify. Yeah, both in terms of the types of energy we use and where we get them from.
Okay, so let's get real here. What does this energy crisis actually mean for everyday people? How is it going to affect our lives?
Well, we're already seeing it, right? Higher energy bills, prices going up on everything from groceries to gas.
Yeah.
It's a real strain on families and businesses, especially those who are already struggling.
It's a reminder that these global events have real consequences for people just trying to get by.
Absolutely. And it shows how important it is for governments to step up and help those who are vulnerable.
To help.
To help with things like promoting energy efficiency, investing in renewable energy infrastructure, and providing financial assistance where it's needed.
So we've explored this conflict, the power dynamics, and this global energy crisis.
Yeah.
What are the big takeaways you want our listeners to remember?
I think the main point is that we're all connected. What happens in one part of the world affects everyone. The conflict in Ukraine and this energy crisis are perfect examples of that.
It's like that butterfly effect idea, but on a global scale.
Exactly. And this crisis, it presents both challenges and opportunities.
How so?
It challenges our energy security, our economic stability, even our way of life.
Right.
But it's also a chance to break away from old patterns and build a better future.
A cleaner, more sustainable future.
Exactly. And amidst all this uncertainty, we need to remember that we have the power to shape that future.
It's not all doom and gloom then.
No, not at all. But we can't forget about the human cost of these global events. Behind the headlines, there are real people whose lives are being turned upside down.
Yeah, that's really important to remember.
We need to approach these issues with empathy and a commitment to finding peaceful solutions.
Well said. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the battlefields in Ukraine to the global scramble for energy. Hopefully you all have a better understanding of this complex situation.
Yeah.
And maybe a renewed sense of urgency to get involved, to do something.
That's what we hope for.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.